The front door opened before anyone in that living room had finished deciding what to do with me. I was standing in my own house in my dress uniform, Zoe balanced on my hip, still smelling faintly of the daycare's crayon boxes and the recycled air of a transport flight. Derek had a manila folder in his hand. His mother, Karen, stood beside the coffee table like she'd been rehearsing her posture for an hour. "Cold as ice," Derek said, and set the folder down flat. "She's not my child." Zoe's small fingers curled tighter into my collar. Nobody in that room looked at her when he said it. They looked at me. "Get out of my house," Karen said, and pointed at the door like she owned it, which, in a sense, in that family, she believed she did. I opened my mouth. Nothing useful came out. Then the door opened behind me, and the man who walked through it made every person in that room go quiet in a completely different way. Captain Morgan. Lieutenant Colonel Faith Okafor stood in the doorway in her service uniform, a small velvet box still in one hand, the kind that holds a commendation nobody in that room was going to remember by morning. "Somebody want to tell me what I just walked into?" The paper airplane hit the refrigerator and slid down behind the trash can, and Zoe laughed so hard she nearly fell off the kitchen stool. That had been 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks of a deployment that ran longer than it was supposed to. 6 weeks of a phone that rang less and less on the other end. And one text from Derek the morning I flew home. "Don't be late tonight. Mom has a surprise waiting for you." I'd smiled reading it in the terminal at Fort Campbell, still in my flight suit, still smelling like jet fuel in the inside of a Black Hawk cockpit. A surprise. After months of clipped calls and messages that read more like status reports than a marriage, I let myself believe Karen had finally decided to welcome me instead of tolerating me. I should have known better. 9 years married to a man teaches you the difference between his silences. I just hadn't learned yet how to read the loud ones. Derek had wanted to be a real estate developer since before I met him, the kind of ambition that photographs well and pays unevenly. His first firm folded in our second year of marriage. The second lasted longer, long enough that he'd started believing in it, long enough that its failure 4 years later took something from him that never quite grew back. By the time I made captain, he'd stopped introducing himself at parties as anything at all, just stood a half step behind me, while people asked about deployments and flight hours, and never once asked what he did. I don't think he hated me for it. Not at first. I think he hated the shape of the room whenever we walked into one together, the way people's eyes found me before they found him. Karen made it worse without meaning to, the way mothers sometimes do. Always some comment about how tired I looked, how much Zoe needed a mother who was actually present, how Derek deserved better than a wife who put a uniform before her family. She said these things smiling, the kind of smile that made objecting feel unreasonable. There was a version of Karen I used to believe in, early on. She'd taught me how to make her mother's cornbread the first Thanksgiving I spent with the family, patient about my terrible knife skills, laughing when I burned the first batch. I used to think that woman was still in there somewhere, underneath the version who counted the days I'd been gone, like she was keeping a ledger against me. Maybe she was. Maybe that only made it worse, knowing she was capable of warmth, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that I hadn't earned it. I never told Derek about the note writing, the way I'd started leaving small folded messages in Zoe's daycare bag before deployments. "You are the bravest 2-year-old I know." She couldn't read yet. I don't think the notes were ever really for her. I think I needed to put something true into the world in a house where his silence had started taking up so much room that even the walls seemed to hold their breath around it. 3 weeks before I shipped out this last time, I found Derek in his study at midnight, laptop open, 3 tabs closed too fast when I walked in. I didn't ask. Some quiet trained into me by 9 years of marriage told me some questions are better asked once you already have the answer. I didn't have the answer yet. Not then. Lieutenant Colonel Faith Okafor caught me in the hallway outside operations 2 days before I rotated home. The kind of officer who remembered everyone's flight hours and asked about their kids by name. "You look tired, Morgan," she said, not unkindly. "Long rotation, ma'am." "That'll do it." She studied me a beat longer than the comment required. "Everything all right at home?" I told her it was fine. I believed it mostly. The way you believe a house is sound because you haven't yet found the crack running through the foundation. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd be in the area the week I got back, some ceremony for outstanding officers, and that she might stop by the house if the timing worked out. I thought that was kindness. I didn't understand yet it would also make her a witness. The morning I landed, I picked Zoe up from daycare and drove home with the windows cracked because she liked the sound of wind. She reached for me the second she saw me, babbling something that might have been mama and might have been nothing at all, and for the length of that car ride, I let myself believe the surprise waiting at home was actually good news. I remember the small things about that drive with the particular clarity of a moment you don't yet know you'll need to remember. The bow slipping sideways in Zoe's hair. The gas station where I stopped for coffee I never drank. The way she kicked her feet against the car seat in time with the radio, delighted by nothing in particular. The way toddlers are delighted by the simple fact of being alive and moving through the world. The house looked warm from the driveway. Every light on, cars lined along the curb, Derek's truck, his sister's SUV, his uncle's old sedan. I remember thinking, well, Karen went all out this time. I laughed a little, actually laughed, standing there with Zoe on my hip, and the porch light throwing long shadows across the lawn, thinking maybe this really was the start of something better. I carried Zoe up the front steps, still smiling. The living room was full when I opened the door. Nobody stood. Nobody said welcome home. The warmth I'd imagined from the driveway had already curdled into something else entirely by the time I crossed the threshold, though it would take me another 30 seconds to understand exactly what. Karen's phone screen read a number with a Nashville area code, saved under no name at all, and she stepped out onto her own back porch to take the call like the walls of her house might be listening. "I need the report finalized by Thursday," she said, low, glancing once at the kitchen window where Derek stood with his back to her, pretending to load the dishwasher. "Whatever you need to make it look right. I'll wire the rest once it's done." A pause, then quieter, almost businesslike. "Heritage Path has done this before. Don't tell me it's complicated now." She hung up before the technician could finish answering, slid the phone into her cardigan pocket, and walked back inside, like she'd only stepped out for air. 3 days later, 12 miles from that kitchen, I sat at Danielle Ruiz's dining table with Zoe finally asleep in a borrowed crib down the hall, staring at a printout Lieutenant Colonel Okafor had helped me request, through channels I didn't fully understand yet and didn't ask too many questions about. Heritage Path Labs wasn't accredited. It wasn't even licensed for paternity testing in the state of Kentucky. I read that line 4 times before it settled into something I could hold on to. "You're sure?" Danielle said, refilling my coffee I hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Faith pulled the state registry herself. Heritage Path lost its accreditation 11 months ago, insufficient chain of custody documentation on a previous case. I set the paper down like it might still be doing something if I moved too fast. Derek used a lab that isn't even legally allowed to run the test he claims proved I cheated on him. "That's not a mistake," Danielle said. "That's a choice." I thought about the study door at midnight, the browser tabs closed too fast, the 4 minutes on his phone. I'd never thought to question, because questioning it would have meant admitting what I already suspected and wasn't ready to name. That evening, Derek called. Not about Zoe. Not even really about me. "You should let this go. Liv," he said, his voice doing the careful thing it always did now, soft in a way that used to mean tenderness, and now meant something closer to management. "For everyone's sake. Mom's already stressed enough. Derek, the lab isn't licensed." A pause, brief enough that a stranger might have missed it. "I don't know anything about licenses. I just know what the report said. You ordered it. You had to have signed something. I'm hanging up now," he said, and did, before I could say anything else, before my voice could crack the way it wanted to. I sat with the phone in my hand a long moment, Danielle watching me from across the kitchen with an expression that had stopped being patient and started being furious on my behalf. "He's protecting someone," she said finally. "Or something. That wasn't a man defending a decision he believed in. That was a man reading from a script." I thought about Karen's ledger of my absences, the years of comments about a wife who put her uniform before her family, and something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The next morning, I drove back to the house while Derek was supposedly at a showing. I told myself I only wanted a few of Zoe's things. I told myself several things, that morning, that turned out not to be entirely true. The study door was unlocked. His laptop sat open on the desk, screen dimmed but not asleep. I had no intention of reading anything. I want to be honest about that at least, because everything else about that morning felt like a decision I was making one small step at a time, each one easy to justify on its own. A notification slid across the screen. Brianna, everything's set for Thursday. Heritage Path just needs the rest of the payment. My hands went very still on the edge of the desk. I clicked before I could talk myself out of it. The thread went back weeks. Brianna Cole, a name I recognized vaguely from some office holiday party years earlier. Someone Derek had once introduced as just a colleague in the tone menus when a lie hasn't occurred to them yet as necessary. The messages weren't about an affair, not directly, though the shape of one sat underneath every line like a stain that had already set into the fabric. They were about money, about Heritage Path, about making sure, in Brianna's words, that Olivia doesn't fight this once she sees the numbers. I found the bank statement 2 folders down. A transfer of $18,000 out of our joint savings account, 6 weeks earlier, routed to an account I didn't recognize. Then another. Then a consultation invoice from a divorce attorney, dated a full month before I'd ever come home to that so-called welcome dinner. He hadn't reacted badly to a report he believed. He had commissioned one and built an exit around it, weeks before I'd even landed at Fort Campbell. I photographed everything with hands that had gone strange and unfamiliar, clumsy with something other than the steadiness they held during a medevac run. Then I heard a car door outside, and froze. Karen's sedan was pulling into the driveway. She wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, grabbed Zoe's diaper bag, and was in the hallway by the time Karen came through the front door. "I thought I made it clear you weren't welcome here," she said, her voice hard in a way I'd almost gotten used to. "I'm only here for Zoe's things." Her eyes moved to the diaper bag, then back to my face, searching for something. "You've already caused enough damage in this family." I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about a phone call I hadn't heard, but could now, with everything I'd just read, imagine word for word. "I didn't damage anything, Karen," I said quietly. "I just started paying attention." I walked past her without waiting for a response, buckled Zoe into her car seat, with hands that were still shaking, and drove back onto post instead of anywhere else, the gate guard waving me through, with the same routine nod he gave every car, unaware that the woman behind the wheel had just discovered her marriage had been quietly liquidated weeks before anyone bothered to tell her it was over. Case number 24DD00842. Christian Circuit Court, Kentucky. That was the number stamped at the top of the custody petition still sitting, unopened, on the passenger seat, the one Derek's attorney had filed the same week the transfer cleared. I hadn't even read it yet. I'd been too busy trying to understand how a marriage ends in installments you don't notice until someone hands you the final invoice. I sat in the parking lot outside operations a long time before going in, Zoe asleep in the back seat, the photographed screenshot still open on my phone like something radioactive I didn't yet know how to put down. I thought about my father's voice, the one thing in all of this that still felt solid. You don't rush the part that matters, and you don't linger on the part that doesn't. I didn't know yet which part of this I was standing in. I called attorney Renee Castillo's office the next morning, before I let myself think too hard about it, because whatever Derek and his mother believed they had built, I intended to make sure a court saw every piece of it. Attorney Renee Castillo's office smelled faintly of printer toner and the coffee she never seemed to finish, a corner space above a strip mall dry cleaner that did not look like it belonged to someone who'd spent 19 years handling military family law. She read the screenshots twice before she said anything. $18,000, she said finally, tapping the bank statement. 6 weeks before you came home, and a consultation with a divorce attorney a full month before that. She looked up. "Captain Morgan, this isn't a man who panicked. This is a man who planned. Can we use it?" The bank records carefully. The messages, "We'll need to establish how you obtained them without it looking like an unlawful search." She set the papers down. "But the lab report, that's the real gift. Heritage Path isn't accredited. That report should never have existed in the first place, let alone been presented as grounds for a custody claim." I'd brought Zoe with me, asleep in her carrier against my chest, because Danielle had a shift, and there was a particular exhaustion in trying to hold a legal strategy meeting while also keeping a toddler's nap schedule intact. Castillo hadn't blinked at the baby. She'd simply moved a stack of files to make room and kept talking like nothing about the arrangement was unusual. "Tell me about the mother-in-law," she said. "Karen, I thought about the ledger she'd kept for 9 years. Every deployment counted against me like a debt. She's the one who called the lab. I heard part of it, before I ever found the messages. She's the one funding this, I think, more than Derek. Why would she do that? I sat with the question longer than it deserved a simple answer. Derek stopped being someone in that family a long time ago. Not to me. To them. Every conversation was about my flight hours, my deployments, my promotion. I think Karen decided the only way to fix that was to make sure I was the one who looked broken instead. Castillo didn't argue with that. She just said, people don't usually start out cruel. They start out afraid of losing something, and then afraid people do things that look exactly like cruelty from a distance. I thought about the study door, the closed laptop, the 4 minutes on the porch I'd once told myself was about a difficult client. Not evil, maybe. Just two people who'd decided my career, my body, my daughter, were solid enough ground to build an exit on. That night, at Danielle's kitchen table, Zoe finally asleep in the guest room, Danielle poured 2 cups of tea neither of us drank. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you understand everyone's motives so carefully you forget to be angry about what they actually did." I almost laughed. She wasn't wrong. It was easier somehow to diagnose Karen's fear and Derek's shame than to sit with the full weight of $18,000 moved in silence while I was flying medevac runs an ocean away. 2 days later, Derek asked to meet. Not through Castillo. A text, just 3 words. "Can we talk?" I met him at a diner near the base, neutral ground, Danielle watching Zoe so I could go alone. He looked thinner than he had at the dinner 3 weeks earlier, the kind of thin that comes from not sleeping rather than not eating. "I want to withdraw the petition," he said, before I'd even sat down. I studied his face for the calculation I'd learned to recognize, and for once, I didn't find it. He looked like a man who'd woken up somewhere unfamiliar and wasn't sure how he'd gotten there. Why now? Because Mom showed me the invoice from Heritage Path yesterday, itemized, like she was proud of it. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know it was going to look like that on paper. I told myself it was just a formality, until things settled. Seeing it written out made it something else. For a moment, sitting across the cracked vinyl booth, I let myself believe it might actually be that simple. That a man could see an invoice and remember, all at once, what mattered. "I'll call Castillo in the morning," he said. "Tell her to drop it." I went home that night lighter than I had in weeks. The specific lightness of a diagnosis you're relieved turns out to be benign. I didn't sleep much, even so. I lay awake, running back through every word Derek had said in that booth, trying to find the seam where sincerity had turned into performance, and couldn't find one. That was the part that unsettled me most, lying there in the dark. He hadn't seemed like a man reading from a script. He'd seemed, for the length of one diner conversation, like the person I married. Danielle found me at the kitchen table before sunrise, coffee gone cold in front of me. "You believed him," she said. Not a question. "For about 14 hours, yes. That's not a flaw, Liv. That's just what it costs to still have a heart after 9 years of this." Castillo called before 8 the next morning, and her voice had none of the ease Derek's had carried the night before. "The hearing got moved up," she said. "Emergency motion, filed late last night. Brianna Cole's attorney is asking to testify." "Testify about what?" "About you," she said. "Apparently, she's prepared to tell the court you threatened her." I had never spoken to Brianna Cole in my life. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, the phone still pressed to my ear, and thought about Derek's face in that diner booth, the crack in his voice that had sounded, at the time, like the truest thing he'd said to me in months. "He didn't call you last night," I said. "No," Castillo confirmed. "He didn't call anyone. The motion was filed at 11:40 last night. Whatever conversation you had with him yesterday afternoon, Captain Morgan, it wasn't the beginning of him changing his mind." I thought about the invoice Karen had supposedly shown him, proud of it, and understood, all at once, that I'd been handed exactly the version of the story someone wanted me to carry home, feeling lighter, right up until the moment it would hurt the most to feel otherwise. Danielle set her mug down hard enough that it rattled against the table. "Then let Castillo build the case around the architect, not the excuse. Derek's remorse might even be real. It doesn't matter if his mother's still holding the blueprint." I thought about Karen's voice on that porch, low and businesslike, discussing a fabricated report, like a home renovation timeline. Whatever had happened between me and Derek in that diner booth, real or performed, it hadn't touched the actual source of this. Karen had built this months before I ever came home, and she wasn't going to stop building just because her son had a moment of conscience over a cup of coffee. I called Castillo back that morning with a request that surprised even me. I want the state licensing board pulled into this, I said. Not just for our case. Heritage Path shouldn't get to do this to the next family either. Castillo was quiet for a beat. That's not going to speed up your hearing, Captain Morgan. It might even complicate it. I understand that. Then I'll make the call, she said, and something in her voice told me she respected the request more than she was willing to say outright. The county seal behind Judge Harold Pruitt's bench had a chip in the lower left corner, the kind of imperfection you only notice after staring at it for over an hour, waiting for a case number to be called that would decide whether your daughter slept in your house or someone else's. Case number 24DD00842. Christian Circuit Court, Kentucky. I sat beside Renee Castillo at the petitioner's table, hands folded tight enough that my knuckles had gone pale under the fluorescent light. Derek sat across the aisle with his attorney. Karen sat behind him in the gallery, upright, composed, the same posture she'd worn on her own back porch 3 weeks earlier, though she didn't know I knew that yet. Brianna Cole took the stand first. She wore a navy blazer and an expression carefully arranged to look wronged. Miss Cole, her attorney began, can you describe your interaction with Captain Morgan? She threatened me, Brianna said, called my office, told me to stay away from her family. I had never once called Brianna Cole's office. I hadn't known her last name until 3 weeks earlier. Castillo rose when it was her turn, unhurried, a single folder in her hand. Miss Cole, you're claiming a phone call took place on the 14th. Do you have records of that call? A pause. I don't keep records of every call I get. Then let's look at your phone instead. Castillo entered a subpoenaed call log into evidence, sliding a copy across to the clerk. According to this, you received no incoming calls from Captain Morgan's number on the 14th, or any date in the last 6 months. But you did receive a text that day, from Derek Whitfield, that read, quote, everything's set for Thursday. Heritage Path just needs the rest of the payment. Brianna's composure cracked at the edges. That's unrelated. Is it? Castillo let the question sit. Because the timeline suggests you agreed to testify about a threat that never happened 3 days after helping coordinate a fraudulent lab report. Derek's attorney objected. Judge Pruitt overruled him without looking up from his notes. Castillo called the licensing investigator next, a quiet man named Whitfield, no relation, who confirmed Heritage Path Laboratories had lost its accreditation 11 months earlier following a chain of custody violation in an unrelated paternity matter. He confirmed the report submitted as evidence in this custody petition had been generated by a facility with no current legal authority to perform the test at all. Then Castillo called a records custodian from the State Attorney General's office, a woman who spoke in the unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to numbers holding their shape even when people didn't. She confirmed a wire transfer of $18,000 from a joint account belonging to Derek Whitfield and Olivia Morgan, routed through an intermediary account, and finally to Heritage Path Laboratories, 6 weeks before the paternity report was generated. Same account, she said. Same 6 weeks. Not coincidental timing. Sequential timing. I watched Derek during this part of the testimony. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at his hands, folded on the table in front of him, and for the first time since that terrible dinner, he looked less like a man defending a decision and more like someone watching the true shape of it appear in front of him for the first time. Castillo's final witness was a forensic phone analyst who had subpoenaed call records connected to the Heritage Path account. She read a summary aloud, calm and precise. A call placed from Karen Whitfield's registered cell number to Heritage Path Laboratories, lasting 6 minutes, the same week the payment cleared. Judge Pruitt looked up from his notes for the first time in several minutes. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, addressing Karen directly, would you like to respond to this evidence? The courtroom went very quiet. Karen rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, the same careful composure she'd worn on her own porch when she thought no one was listening. I made that call, she said. I don't deny it. Can you explain why? Karen's chin lifted slightly. Because my son was never going to be anyone in that family standing next to her. Every room they walked into, people asked about her flight hours and her medals, and Derek just stood there like furniture. I wasn't going to watch that happen for the rest of his life while she got everything, including our granddaughter, without ever once having to answer for what her career cost this family. So you commissioned a fraudulent report, Judge Pruitt said, to remove a child from her mother's custody in order to protect your son's pride. Karen didn't flinch. I did what a mother does. The words landed in the courtroom the way true things sometimes do, without any of the theatrical weight you'd expect them to carry, just flat and final and somehow worse for how calmly she said them. Judge Pruitt called a brief recess before closing arguments. I stepped into the hallway, needing air that didn't carry the weight of that room, and found Zoe with the courthouse's family liaison at a small table set up for children, crayons scattered across a coloring page. I crouched beside her. "How you doing, baby?" She looked up, serious in the way she got when she'd been listening more closely than anyone realized. "Is Grandma Karen mad at me?" "No, sweetheart. Grandma Karen isn't mad at you." "Then why does everybody look so sad?" Zoe considered this with the particular gravity 2-year-olds bring to things too large for them yet. "Daddy looks like he's sorry." I didn't have a clean answer for that. I pulled her into a hug instead, and for a moment, the hallway, the case number, the sealed courtroom doors all fell away, and there was only the small, solid weight of her against my chest, real and warm, and entirely mine, no matter what any fabricated report had tried to claim otherwise. When court resumed, Judge Pruitt didn't take long. "The court finds the paternity report submitted as Exhibit A to be fraudulent," he said, "generated by an unaccredited facility, funded through a joint marital account without the knowledge or consent of the respondent, and coordinated with a financial arrangement establishing intent to remove a minor child from her mother's custody under false pretenses." He looked at Derek, then at Karen. "This court takes an exceptionally dim view of using a fabricated medical document to sever a mother from her child." Derek didn't speak. He sat very still, staring at the table in front of him, and for the first time since I'd walked into that living room 3 weeks earlier, he looked less like the man who'd slammed a folder onto a coffee table, and more like someone finally seeing, all at once, the true size of what his mother had built, and what he had let her build it with. The courthouse steps still held the afternoon heat when I found Derek sitting alone near the bottom, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up when my shadow crossed him, didn't stand. "I keep trying to figure out when I stopped being someone who loved you," he said, "and started being someone who needed my mother to be right about you. Does it matter which one it was?" I used to think it did. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Heritage Path's license is gone for good now. Brianna's attorney dropped her as a client an hour ago. I might be looking at fraud charges myself, which is almost funny, considering I told myself for weeks this was about protecting Zoe from a mother who was never home." I didn't offer him comfort. Some part of me still wanted to, an old instinct built over 9 years of marriage, but I let it pass through me without acting on it. "Zoe asked me in the hallway if you were sorry," I said. "She said you looked like you were sorry, but she wasn't sure you meant it." Something in his face cracked slightly at that, more than anything the judge's ruling had produced. "She's 2. She shouldn't be able to read a room that well." "She's always been able to read a room, Derek. You just weren't paying attention to what she was picking up." He didn't argue with that. "I'm not offering forgiveness today," I said. "I don't know when I will, or if I will at all. What I'm offering is structure. Supervised visits until the court says otherwise, full transparency on anything involving Zoe, and you complete an actual program, court-ordered, not a formality, before we talk about anything past that. Okay. And you don't get to decide when you've earned trust back. That's not yours to decide anymore." He nodded slowly, some old resistance flickering in his jaw before it settled. "Okay." I walked away from him without looking back, which felt like its own kind of answer. Castillo called that evening with something I hadn't expected. "I need you to make a decision," she said. "Not a legal one, a personal one." "What kind of decision?" "During discovery, the licensing investigator found something outside the scope of your custody case. Heritage Path has apparently run at least 4 other fraudulent paternity reports over the past 2 years, all commissioned through the same intermediary account Karen used. Families who have no idea their custody outcomes were built on the same kind of fabricated evidence you're holding right now." I sat with that for longer than I expected to need. It wasn't mine to report, not directly. It had nothing to do with Zoe, or the ruling already handed down in my favor. Staying quiet wouldn't cost me anything. Speaking up would mean handing the licensing board everything I had, including details about Karen and Derek's finances that went well beyond what any court had asked me to disclose, dragging their names through an investigation that could follow them for years after my own case was already closed. I thought about the porch call I'd overheard before I ever found the messages. Karen's voice discussing a fabricated report, like a renovation timeline. I thought about the 4 other families who might be sitting in courtrooms right now, believing a piece of paper that was never real. Send everything to the licensing board, I said. All of it, not just what's relevant to my case. Castillo was quiet a moment. You understand that's going further than anyone asked you to go. It could expose things about Karen and Derek's finances that have nothing to do with custody. I understand. I didn't examine the decision too closely that night, though I knew, even as I made it, that it sat somewhere in the gray space between justice and something closer to retribution, dressed up as public service. It wasn't only about protecting strangers. Some part of me wanted Karen to feel the full weight of what she'd built, not just the part a family court had bothered to measure. 6 weeks later, Brianna reached out, an unexpected number on my phone one evening, while Zoe colored at the kitchen table. I wanted you to know I ended things with him, she said, before I could say anything. Before any of this came out, I just couldn't keep being someone's alibi. I didn't know what to say to her. We weren't friends, would likely never be, but there was something in her voice that sounded like a woman trying to find solid ground after learning the ground she'd been standing on had never been real. I'm sorry you got pulled into it, I said, and meant it. I'm sorry I almost testified against you, she said. I should have asked more questions before I agreed to any of it. We didn't talk long after that. Derek's supervised visits started the following week. He showed up on time, every time, quieter than he'd been in years, like a man relearning how to occupy a room without needing it to prove something about him. Zoe warmed to him slowly, the way children do when trust has to be rebuilt one ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a time, rather than won back in a single grand gesture. One evening, after he'd gone, Zoe climbed onto the couch beside me, holding a fresh drawing. A family of stick figures crowded loosely around 2 lopsided circles that might have been a house. Is this us now? She asked. I looked at the careful distance she'd drawn between 2 of the figures, a gap that hadn't been there in her drawings, from before any of this started. I think it's still figuring itself out, baby, I said. But yeah, that's us. Karen did not call. Not that week. Not the week after. I hadn't expected her to, and some part of me was grateful for the silence, though another part of me kept waiting for an apology I suspected would never come. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because admitting fault would mean admitting the ledger she'd kept against me for 9 years had been wrong from the very first entry. The licensing board investigation moved quickly once Castillo's files landed on the right desk. Within a month, 3 of the 4 other families Heritage Path had defrauded had been contacted, their custody rulings flagged for review. I never learned all their names, and I told myself that was fine, that the point had never been recognition. The point had been making sure nobody else sat in a courtroom holding a piece of paper that was never real, believing it had already decided who they were allowed to love. The parade field at Fort Campbell caught the last light of evening the way it did most Sundays, the flag snapping once against the pole before settling into stillness. I stood at the fence line with Zoe balanced on my hip, watching a formation run drills in the distance, the sound of boots against packed earth carrying faintly across the grass. She was almost 3 now, heavier in my arms than she'd been the night Derek set that folder down on the tray table, though some nights I still felt the exact weight of her from that evening, more than the weight of her now. Grandpa Hayes used to stand out there, I told her, though she wouldn't remember him. Not really. Just the stories I'd started telling her, instead of the man himself. He used to say, "The sky doesn't care who you are, it only cares whether you did the work." Zoe considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things lately. 3 years old, going on some older version of herself the last few months had quietly built without asking permission. Did you do the work? I think I spent too long believing something wasn't true, I said. That's its own kind of not doing the work, I guess. Believing the wrong thing, because it was easier than looking closer. Heritage Path Laboratories had been formally shut down by the state board, 8 weeks after the ruling, its owner facing charges alongside 3 other defendants connected to the fraudulent report scheme. Karen had been named in a separate civil suit filed by one of the other affected families, a woman from Owensboro I never met but thought about often, wondering if she'd found her own version of the parking lot moment where the truth finally outweighed the fear. Derek had completed his court-ordered program without missing a single session, something Castillo told me surprised even her. His visits with Zoe had become steadier, still supervised, still careful, but real in a way that felt earned rather than performed. He'd started seeing a counselor on his own, separate from the mandated sessions, something he'd chosen rather than something ordered, and there was a difference in the way he spoke now, less like a man defending a version of himself, and more like one actually listening to what he'd built and why. I'd made Major 2 months earlier, the promotion ceremony small, held in the same building where Lieutenant Colonel Okafor had once tried to hand me a commendation before everything unraveled. She pinned the new rank herself, her hands as steady as they'd been the night she walked through my front door, and asked a room full of people what she'd just interrupted. "I'm proud of the officer you've become," she said afterward. Then she looked down at Zoe, tugging impatiently at my sleeve, and even prouder of the mother. Zoe tugged again, and I crouched down to her level, letting her point out a soldier in the distance, whose posture she'd decided, for reasons known only to a 3-year-old, was the best one in the formation. "Do you think Daddy's sorry now?" she asked, the question arriving sideways, the way her hardest ones always did. "For real this time. I think he's getting there," I said. "Sorry isn't something you say once and finish. It's something you keep doing, every ordinary day, until the people you hurt start to believe you." She nodded like that made sense to her, in the particular way children accept complicated truths without needing every piece explained, and went back to watching the formation, already losing interest in the conversation the way 3-year-olds do, moving on to whatever came next before the adults in the room were ready to. We stood there a while longer, until the formation dispersed and the light went the deep blue that comes right before full dark, Zoe's small hand warm inside mine, the fence cool under my other palm. "If you were in my position, would you have made the same choice I did, sending everything to the licensing board even though it went further than the court ever asked? Or does justice have a line it shouldn't cross, even when the people on the other side of it deserve every bit of what's coming?" Let me know what you think in the comments. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There's another one waiting next week.